Hi everyone! For those of you who have watched my channel for a while, you might remember that I've done a lot of videos about the Hugo Awards. For the past 2 years, I did these Hugo Awards reading projects where I would read all of the nominees in certain categories, or not all the nominees, sorry, all of the finalists, all of the shortlist for certain categories for that year's Hugo Awards. So usually I would do Best Novel and Best Series, and I think last year, you might remember I also read the finalists for the Best Novella category, which was kind of a disaster because I still kind of hate novellas, so obviously that wasn't a huge success. So this year, obviously, I wasn't really filming videos for a lot of the year so far, and I haven't really been keeping up with the Hugos. I think the finalists got announced, it was maybe like the week before I moved in April or something like that, so I was just very much not into that this year. And also I feel like I haven't done as good a job keeping up with new releases for the past year and a half, which honestly is not a bad thing because when I went to do the Hugo Awards project last summer, I was kind of disappointed. I think I had read either every single finalist or all but one. So I'm kind of glad now to be going through a phase where I'm actually less in the loop with new releases because it's kind of fun to get to discover stuff. And if you're always really on top of it, then nothing ever like takes you by surprise, if that makes sense. But it's just a couple of days until this year's Hugo Awards winners get announced. So I thought I would just take a couple of minutes to look at this year's finalists and just comment on maybe some thoughts that I have about them. I haven't read everything on either the best novel list or the best series list, but I've read a few on each, so I could do sort of an informal ranking here. This is even less serious than usual because I haven't been following this too closely. So out of the 6 finalists for best novel, I have read 4 of them. 1 I have not read and 1 I actually DNF'd. So I'll just quickly go through these. I'll kind of do this in a very rough ranking, but I haven't given this a great deal of thought, I have to admit. So the one that I haven't read is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. So this is actually a book that I checked out from the library a bunch of times. I kept intending to read it. I thought it looked very interesting. I know that it's a fantasy retelling that has something to do with Chinese history, and it seemed pretty appealing to me, but for whatever reason, all the times that I checked it out, I just never got around to reading it, and I still want to, so hopefully I will at some point. So obviously I can't comment on what I thought of this book, but it was something that was on my radar, that was something that I would be interested in. I just never got around to it. And just to get it over with, the one that I DNF'd was Light from Uncommon Stars by Ryka Aoki. And I think I had a post at one point about this book too. So I feel kind of almost bad for saying this, because it seems like this is a book that a lot of people really connected with, and the main point of the book, as far as I know, it's an LGBTQ story. It has a lot to do with identity and a lot of probably very profound themes, but it also has to do with violinists, and I'm a professional musician, my husband's a professional violinist, and there was a music mistake relatively early on in this book that actually made me just rage quit the book, which doesn't happen very often, but it was just so obvious to me that the author had not had like a single violinist, I'm assuming, read this, that I just couldn't. And I know sometimes, it's always hard to read books where there is someone being portrayed as an expert or something, and something that you're actually an expert in. But authors have gotten really good these days, especially with the internet, at getting sort of expert readers and things like that. So I'm not really making a judgment on the quality of the book. It may be a very fine book, but I know I just couldn't get past this really obvious mistake, even if it wasn't important to the theme of the book. For those of you who are curious, I guess I'll give a really short explanation right now, because I know some of you like my musician rants, and if you really don't care, just skip. I'll timestamp this, just skip to the next book. So one of the themes in this book that's explored is sort of this I guess I'd call it almost like a archetypical folk story about a violinist selling their soul to the devil. This is in The Soldier's Tale, The Devil Went Down to Georgia. Like, this is something that I can't remember even what the original origin of this story is, but it's sort of a trope. It's kind of a thing. So there's a character, from what I remember, who had sold her soul to the devil in exchange for probably, like supreme violin powers, basically. and then part of the plot of the book is about her having to deliver the souls of other prodigies to the devil so that she can be free. I may not be getting this exactly right because I think it was January that I looked at this book. It's been a little while. So another character was recounting an experience that this character who sold her soul had as a young violinist, where she was performing a concerto, which is where you have a soloist in front of the orchestra, and she had a string on her violin break. So this is the thing that happens, not constantly, but it's definitely happens more often than anyone wants it to happen, obviously. So when you lose a string, you can't keep playing unless it's the name of the wind and your kavoth, and it's a lute, and that is the whole plot about that, but never mind that. So she breaks a string, and usually what happens when a violinist breaks a string is they'll trade their violin, usually to the concertmaster, which is the person who's sitting first chair violin in the orchestra. So they'll take that person's violin and continue the concerto on that, because it takes some time to change a string. And either they'll finish the concerto on the borrowed instrument, or maybe somebody will restring their violin. Like, you can do sort of a sneaky pass back off stage or something like that, and maybe they'll get it back, But most likely, depending on where you are in the concerto, or if they were right at the beginning of a movement, maybe they would even just pause and change the string on their own instrument. Again, this isn't something that happens all the time, but you can see videos of this happening to famous violinists. So according to this story in the book, she broke a string on 2 instruments. So it means she broke a string on her violin, and then she broke a string on the borrowed violin. This is also a thing that could happen. I'm not sure if I've seen a video of this happening, but yeah, you could get really unlucky, especially if it was like really hot or something like that might just make an instrument freak out. Okay, but then what it says is she broke a string on 2 instruments and then finished the concerto on a viola. Now, a viola is not a violin. A viola has different strings than a violin. It's pitched lower. I guess there's like a really, 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 really slim chance the author was trying to make this point, like, she has such amazing powers from the devil that she can actually play something that is impossible according to the laws of physics to play on a viola. But I think it was just a tossed off comment that made no sense, because even if you broke strings on 2 violins, there's still, depending on the size of the orchestra, 10 to 20, 30 more violins you could go through. It just makes no sense. It's not just impressive. In fact, it's not impressive at all. It's just physically not possible, and also really stupid, because why would you go for a different instrument when you have like 15 more of your instrument on stage, right? Like, if you broke 2 strings on 2 different violins, just take a 3rd violin. Like, why the hell not? So that was the thing where I did screenshot this and send it to my husband, but I just quit the book. I'm like, I can't read a book about violinists where somebody put that in it. It's just too silly, and just shows, I'm assuming that any violinist, like any person with more than passing familiarity with string instruments, would have told the author, like, hey, why'd you put that? Because there are times where, like, okay, maybe she really meant it. That needed a little more context than a tossed off comment, right? So this may be the best book of the year, but I just could not get past that thing. Okay, on to the last 4 books that were finalists for this year's Hugo for Best Novel, all of which I basically liked, so it's kind of hard to actually rank some of these, to be fair. I'm gonna say in 4th place, even though it's a book I really liked, The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers. So this is the last book in her Wayfarers series, which I overall really enjoyed. There was one book in the series that totally did not work for me. I think it was the 3rd one. The first one I quite liked, second one I liked a lot. This last one I also liked a lot. So it's definitely, this series is known for being kind of plotless and more on the cozy side, which totally works for me most of the time. I don't mind character-driven books that don't have a strong plot. I read this book long ago enough that I don't remember it super well and haven't reviewed it, but I definitely have very positive feelings towards it, and I overall enjoyed this series. In third place, I'm going to put A Master of Djinn by P. Djeli Clark. This is the novel in his Cairo series. I did read this whole series this year. It starts out with 2 works of short fiction, and then it goes into this novel. So I'm not a huge short fiction person most of the time, but sometimes series of novellas and things like that I can get a little bit more into. So I think the first one, I think it's called A Dead Djinn in Cairo, I was okay with it. It was actually just a little short for my taste. I would have loved to see it longer and more developed. And then the second one, which is The Haunting of Tramcar something or another, which is sort of focused around a different character. I actually loved that one. And A Master of Djinn, I did not love it, but what I really like, I think he's built a super fascinating world. He has a real gift with characters. He creates these characters where you really like them, and somehow you feel like you get to the core of who they are as people in the way he describes them, even sometimes within a few sentences, with like how they dress and act, and you just get this really strong sense of who they are. And even when you haven't spent like a ton of page time with them compared to some other series, they kind of feel like old friends already. So I love all that, and I think he has super fascinating world building, but there was just some things in this book that I felt like as a novel, it didn't 100% work. Mostly, I was loving it from the beginning, and then the middle section like veered off like it was gonna be some other book, and I kind of started disliking it. It went into a bunch of sort of political world building, which, like, it was fine, but it felt like it was starting to be something else, and then it kind of veers back and goes to like where it started out, and this isn't a super long book either. So in the end, the ending was pretty satisfying. I still rated this book fairly highly in the end, but it just wasn't a slam dunk. He didn't knock it out of the park. I think I need to get away from sports metaphors because I don't watch sports. So it wasn't a perfect novel. I don't think I would rate it as the winner, but I still really like this series. I liked the book. And now it's really, really hard to decide how to rank things because we have A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine, which is the follow-up to A Memory Called Empire, which won the Hugo in 2020, which was the first year I started like reading the Hugo shortlists. And then we have Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, Now the problem is it has now been closer to 2 years since I read A Desolation Called Peace, because I think it came out the very, very beginning of 2021. I don't know if it was January or March, so maybe it's been a year and a half. But anyway, lots happened in my life. I remember liking this book. I think I have some reviews up. I think I even have a spoiler discussion video with my husband. So I definitely really liked A Desolation Called Peace, and I think that's probably my number 1 on this list of finalists, but it's just been too long. I read Project Hail Mary last summer, and I read it twice. I read it once and then I listened to it on an audiobook about a month later, so it's a little fresher in my memory. I think A Desolation Called Peace is perhaps the stronger book and probably my favorite, but I would honestly want to reread it. And if I had been doing this Hugo Awards project properly this year, like I did the past 2 years, I think I would have at this point tried to reread it. Project Hail Mary is a very fun book. I know Andy Weir is more of a popular writer and not always the most serious science fiction, but what I really like about his writing is I feel like I am a person who is not super interested in the details of science a lot of the time. So he is really good at making me interested in the science that he's talking about and using it in a plot in a way that kind of works and makes a sort of average reader able to engage with that. It's almost like it's almost like Brandon Sanderson has a rule that he talks about for how the more that you explain the magic, the more you can use it in the resolution of the plot. And I feel like the science it's the same way. I guess anything would be the same way, right? Not just magic. So I feel like Andy Weir is very effective at using science in a way that a not super science interested person can at least sort of, when it gets used in the plot, I could be like, oh yeah, cool, I sort of mildly saw that coming because I was paying attention to what you were talking about. There were some very lovable characters, and honestly, I kind of like the way that he writes very optimistic, terrible scenarios. Like, he seems to write a lot about characters that are in almost certain death scenarios that have a, I can science my way out of this and we're optimistic about the future of humanity. Like sometimes it's nice to have that, So I really did like Project Hail Mary. I think I'm gonna put Desolation Called Peace as my favorite, but it was kind of tough in terms of enjoyment level. I honestly have less to say about best series this year because most of them I haven't read. Gosh, the only series that I have read all of on this year's shortlist is Wayward Children by Seanan McGuire. I was joking earlier this year that I keep reading the new Wayward Children novellas, and I'm not sure why, because I don't like the series, and I don't really like novellas anyway, but I have to say I read the one that came out this year, which I'm not sure is even included in this consideration because these are all books from 2021. I think this was like number 7 or 8 that came out this year, and I actually kind of liked it. This was I just had to read like 7 Wayward Children novellas before I found one I actually liked, I guess. It's like a law of nature that Seanan McGuire must be on every best series shortlist, so there you have it. Then out of things I'm at least kind of familiar with, The Green Bone Saga by Fonda Lee. I know this is a favorite for a lot of people. I should probably give it another shot. I very barely started the first one at one point and just wasn't in the mood for it at the time. So I can't even call it a DNF. I read maybe not even an entire chapter, and I just felt like it wasn't. Sometimes that happens. It might be a good book, but you're not in the mood then. I felt like at the time it wasn't something I would like, but I've heard so many people talk about it as an exceptional series, I should probably try it again. Then we have The Kingston Cycle by C.L. Polk. I read the first book, which I liked pretty well, and then again I started the second one and just could not get into it. I think enough time had passed and just I couldn't really remember what was going on. It just wasn't really speaking to me. I think again it may have been more of an issue of timing than anything wrong with the book itself, but haven't read any more of that, so can't really talk about the whole series. The first one was fine. I think those are the only ones that I'm familiar with. We have Merchant Princes by Charles Stross, who can't say I've actually ever read anything by him. I looked it up. It sounded kind of interesting. It was like a portal science fantasy with like alternate history or alternate worlds or something, which I'm not a huge portal fantasy person, but the concept sounded kind of cool, I guess. Then we have Terra Ignota by Ada Palmer, which also I don't think I've read anything by this author. I definitely haven't read this series. I looked it up. It seems like it's a futuristic science fiction that might be sort of hybrid utopia dystopia story, like a future science fiction story exploring a world in which people are just living very differently than today. So I would consider reading that. It doesn't necessarily call to me as something that would be something I would choose to read, but hypothetically, I would read that. And then we have The World of the White Rat by T. Kingfisher. I don't know why that's hard to say. I also haven't read anything by her, but I looked this series up. It does look more in the vein of comic fantasy, or like there might be a more humorous aspect to it. So again, I don't really know too much more about this, but it seemed kind of fun, so I might try that. So yeah, really can't do any kind of ranking on best series this year because I just have very little familiarity with it, but if you wanted to know, that was the list. So thanks so much for watching. Maybe next year I'll get back to doing more proper Hugo Awards coverage. Kind of just depends on my timing and making videos. So that was my very small take on the Hugo Awards this year. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, what you think was the best if you've read all of these books, and I'll see you next time.